Hello, everyone. This is the Oneness Talking Point with Melanie Brockwell. I think this is episode, looking at my calendar, 12. This is a makeup show for Living Master. And I know I had that short explanation video of technical difficulties last Monday when it was meant to go live. And it's hard to explain what happens. And I think it's even harder to explain the peace that comes with the fact that I experience, okay, I guess this is what's happening right now. And it's tempting to say, that's what happens when you realize you're a living master. That's what happens when you realize you're a heart alchemist. That's what happens when you're in the oneness experience, because we're so used to attaching some kind of outcome to the label that we're giving, the ideal. You know, we have some definition of what it will mean to whatever the thing, whatever the XYZ at the end of that sentence is. And for me, the concept of living master is a very different proposition. I guess within the oneness explanation of all that is, the idea that we are all doing what we can with what we have, that there are no exceptions to that rule, that everyone is living by the same proposition. They're experiencing it as a different whirlpool in the oneness, and it looks like they're expressing divinity in unique ways. But it seems like and looks like and feels like as a whirlpool of oneness. So there's no point of objectivity that anyone can come to in order to judge or assess or define something else in its true form or formlessness. You know, the way we try and put together a list of characteristics and say, this makes you clever, or this makes you athletic, or this makes you a Christian, or this makes you a good parent. You know, all of those things come with a cultural assumption. And there's all this fuzziness at the foundation of those assumptions. You know, when you really get into that whole ontological exploration and examination of the cultural assumptions at the foundation of our labels for criminal, good parent, Christian, there's a lot of unanswered questions, or unanswerable questions, really, probably more to the point, for those people who are not bringing an answer with them. You know, if you're the but why child, you're constantly asking, yes, but why? Instead of stopping at the explanation that says, because they're a sociopath, yeah, but why? Because this happened to them, yeah, but why? Because their brain is wired this way, yes, but why? You know, like if you're constantly open, I guess, to the, you know, if you're constantly curious about the formulation of, not so much the cause. I know the why question is really, you know, for most people it's a grappling with the cause, the causation. But for the but why child, it's often not a sense of causes. It's often a, so what makes it that way, you know, in the configuration of everything that is. So when you put the blocks together to make a castle, you know, the child is interested in where you put the blocks in order to make the castle. There's not a but why of the physics of how the blocks sustain that shape. And, like it's a very different who made it so versus what are all the elements involved. And I think a query into what are all the elements involved goes into the far reaches of an examination of one's own assumptions. So the idea that the mind is a thing that can be known and explained and defined and put in opposition to other things is all well and good. And the but why child is also asking the question, does the mind exist in everyone's cosmology? And if it doesn't, where did it come from in my cosmology? What allowed the concept of the mind to exist at all as a thing that can be pointed to? So even when we come to the living master sense of what's going on, I think a lot of the information, for want of a better word, that I get is not about how to make concrete, how to solidify and define and draw conclusions and compare and have lists of characteristics. It feels more ephemeral. It feels like a truth that can only be known when you're not looking at it, if that makes sense. So for me, we are all living masters. There's something about, I don't know whether it's the equality or the equity, but there's something in each one of us is in some way exactly the same, even though each one of us is incredibly unique in each and every moment. But this conversation is not so much about that. It's that sense of living mastership has been given a position on the hierarchy. It's an attainable goal. It's a list of characteristics that one carries when they have achieved enlightenment, or when they have done enough for other people in a recognizable way that those people are grateful for. It's a wisdom that can be appreciated by people who challenge the notion of everything being wisdom. But what would happen if the assumption was that we are all living masters, and the investigation was a curiosity about how is that so? So if you already woke up in a world and there was a natural assumption, you didn't impose it upon yourself because that's what a good Christian does, or that's what a wise Buddhist does, or that's what an enlightened spiritualist does. It just comes with waking up. There is a sense inside of you that everything makes sense, that everything is part of a configuration of elements that has a natural explanation, where everything seems perfectly logical if you could only see all of the elements involved. What would happen if you lived in a world where living mastership wasn't a goal? It wasn't an admirable person or way of being, but it was a natural assumption. And then in the meeting of what we call self and other, there was a wondering of how is that possible? How is that true here? The same way the assumption that the perfection of all that is in what is. And so in the meeting of what is, which includes all the things we call self and thoughts and, worries and drama and war and outside and inside. And what if the assumption was perfection already existed, and the perception of the things that we label war and drama and good and bad, etc., became a playground in which to investigate the perfection of all that is, where you ask, and how is it so here? How is it so here? So instead of meeting the reality of a conflict with a partner, you meet the reality of a moment of perfection that appears to be a conflict with a partner and become curious in your assumption of the perfection of what is. Now, I'm not saying that's what living masters do. I'm just using that as another example of, what happens in the meeting of an assumption. What happens in the everyday experience of an underlying assumption. So I guess if, so you can kind of use it in reverse to become aware of your assumptions as well. So if you're meeting the moment as an opportunity for self-awareness, or if you're meeting the moment as, a means to a profitable end, if you're meeting the moment as a challenge to overcome something, then that's also telling you what your assumptions are, which are, for the most part, invisible. We don't walk around knowing what our assumptions are. That's why they're assumptions. They're often, they call internalized, if you believe in that internal external picture of the universe. So the picture of the world where living masters are only people who can do magic, heal or provide sage wisdom that's recognized as wisdom. There's an assumption that there is a hierarchy and that some people are higher in that hierarchy and some people are lower. And I guess it's up to you, if that's your assumption, to figure out what the rules are. How do you know one person is higher than another? If they are providing sage wisdom now, but 5 years ago they were a criminal, or, put them somewhere lower on the hierarchy, then does that even out? Or is the truth of their living wisdom in the now of who they are? Or, so you can kind of play with that awareness for yourself. But in the oneness talking point, we are all living masters. And that investigation that people have with me, if that's a curiosity that they have, if they want to discover or reveal or investigate, explore, experiment with their living mastership just as they are, rather than following steps to get to a point where it is so by playing in the world of the assumption that it is already true. It's quite revealing, you know, the people that have that experience with me, the person who assumes they are already a living master, there's often a rejection of themselves as perfect just as they are. And then having someone sit with them, accepting, well, then that must be what needs to be right now, rather than challenging it and trying to talk them into something else. Having someone who's able to be with whatever is true for you right now. There's a lot of space, and that space can be uncomfortable sometimes. You know, we're not used to having that much space, making our own rules about what's true for us. We're used to someone or something rushing in to fill that space and move us in a particular direction. And when we don't have that, when we are the arbiters of our truth, you know, and the leaders of what happens next, it's the novelty that's uncomfortable. Just like any novelty is uncomfortable, you know, and it's that discomfort that's it's a really beautiful thing. It is the mystery. So that's often why I call it the mystery of mastery, because mastery is not knowing in both sense of the word. You know, it's the absence of knowing, but it's also not knowing. It's the presence of not knowing. You know, there's this amazing experience available in the presence of not knowing, as much as there is an amazing experience available in the absence of knowing. And they're not the same thing. So the presence of not knowing is an acceptance, is an allowing. It's an assumption that it's true. Whereas the absence of knowing is that uncomfortable space as a discomfort, as a lack. And even in the discomfort and the lack, I still find that a powerful place to be. Place, you know, the idea of taking up space. And it's not so much a means to an end, this concept of everyone being a living master. You know, like, it's not a remedy for hatred or displeasure or judgment. It's just one of those underlying assumptions of what is true for me, that we are all living masters. It just makes sense. And you don't have to do anything to prove it to me. You don't have to live up to any standard of yourself or carry out any particular principles in order for me to recognize it. It's one of the assumptions that I walk around with. I don't have to impose it on the world in order to see it. It's already visible. I'm just trying to think of another way, like what are some of the other assumptions that either I make or people make that we walk around with, and they kind of enlighten or educate or fill in the blanks for us about the world, even though we still get shocked and curious and judgmental. Those assumptions are still founding assumptions that are present in how the world is illuminating for us. They're educating our perspective without us having to think about it. Like if you take on a principle that's not an assumption, like later on this morning, I'm doing this week's show about compassion. If you have to impose compassion because it's not a natural place for you to live from, then the assumption I keep getting the word educating, that's educating your perspective is not compassion, it's something else. And you impose compassion and try and put it between you and the assumptions that are lighting up the world in a particular way. So the world is being lit up in a way that you think some people are wrong. You think some people are cruel. You think some people don't deserve love or to live or to have what they have. That's a lack of compassion. There's no curiosity about the person and what they're going through. You're imposing judgments upon what people deserve and don't deserve. That's a lack of compassion. So the thing that's educating your perspective is, the underneath. It's actually making it visible. It's making the world visible in a particular way where people deserve and don't deserve. And then you bring compassion and you want to put it in front of you. You want to have it as like this filter that stands between you and the natural picture of the world. So for me, a living master doesn't have to do a particular thing in order to qualify. So the natural assumption is that we are all, it's that we're all living masters, but it's more than that. It's that what makes that possible, what makes it possible for me to assume we are all living masters, because that idea came, very late in the game. That wasn't a notion. That's a very cultural notion. The assumptions that allow that to be articulated are about oneness, the equity of spirit, the equity of we are all doing what we can with what we have, where all of the elements of everything are equally distributed in perfection. Not perfection as the, the goal of the world looking a particular way and people acting a particular way. I'm talking about the innate perfection. The innate perfection that includes discomfort. The innate perfection that includes what we call death. The innate perfection of pain. The innate perfection of people believing that there is imperfection. The inclusiveness of all of that experience itself being valuable, rather than having an assessment where we judge some experiences as not so valuable and other experiences as higher in the hierarchy. And so that allows for a curiosity without judgment. That allows for a curiosity that accepts and allows what is, and is able to live in that space of not knowing quite comfortably, with the pain and discomfort and uncertainty, with the loss and tears and starvation, with all of that, and still assume perfection. I'm not sure why we keep going off on this oneness tangent today in the discussion about living master. And I think it's not to diminish the hallowed ground, the worship of the ascended masters or the other masters that are culturally understood, venerated as wise and compassionate, and ideals that we look up to and strive to satisfy, strive to be, strive to emulate. I don't think the concept that we are all living masters diminishes any of that. It feels more like when the ladder is vertical and then we all of a sudden we stand in a place and the ladder is horizontal, and we understand the spectrum, we understand the equality, we understand the wholeness of each section or rung of that ladder that we once thought we were climbing, and then have another experience where we understand that it's a circle. There's no division. You still appreciate the color of red. You may still be more attracted to the color of green, but it doesn't make it any less than the color of gray and the essentialness of every color. I guess that becomes more apparent when someone begins to see, the spectrum as a single point. So all of those colors are actually just one. Instead of believing that there is a red, because ultimately there are all the shades that go from the color before to the color after, and there is no line, there's no border between them. And if all of those colors are not separate, then they are just one. And if we need to understand them as separate, then we will. And if we need to turn our ladder vertically and see it as a climb, then we will. I don't think anything is diminished from a different perspective. There's something about honoring the living master that you are that's important for me. I guess that, that makes it hard for me to stay in this one point where I go, this is the one that's talking point and this is the truth, and I'm just going to talk about that, because there's something inside me that says that's not true. The one that's talking point is just part of a conversation, and you're part of that conversation as the living master that you are. And if we ever get the chance to talk, the conversation we will have will be about you. It won't be about me trying to figure out how you're the same or different to me. It'll be about your perfection, and then it'll be, whether that's true for you or not. And if it's true for you, we go in that direction. And if it's not true for you, we go in that direction. And we honor whatever it is that you find in that space where someone else is not filling it up with what they want for you. Okay, I'm going to I'm going to press the stop broadcast button and get ready for the next episode, which is all about compassion. So have a fantastic day.